Sometimes, a single moment of kindness can change everything we thought we knew about love. In a world where strength often meant cruelty, Isabella Fairchild discovered that the gentlest hearts sometimes come in the most unexpected packages. When masked bandits attacked her stagecoach on the dusty trail to Canyon Ridge, this wealthy heiress faced certain death. That's when Garrison Big Gus McCall appeared, a giant of a man whose massive frame moved with surprising grace. His quick thinking and brave heart saved her life. Grateful beyond words, Isabella offered him 3 wishes as a reward. But when this gentle cowboy made his first request, her cheeks turned bright red with embarrassment. His simple words caught her completely off guard. What could a rugged frontier man possibly ask for that would leave such a worldly woman so flustered? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden planks of Canyon Ridge's main street as Isabella Fairchild stepped down from her battered stagecoach, her emerald silk dress now torn and dusty from the harrowing encounter just hours before. The emerald brooch at her throat, a family heirloom passed down through 3 generations of Fairchild women, caught the light as she moved, its polished surface a stark reminder of the privileged world she'd left behind in Boston. Isabella had never imagined that inheriting her great-uncle's ranch would require such a treacherous journey. At 26, she possessed the sharp intellect that had helped her navigate Boston's complex social circles and the family textile business. But nothing in her refined education had prepared her for masked bandits with murder in their eyes. The memory of those desperate moments still made her hands tremble. The way her driver Jake had reached for his rifle, only to be struck down by the bandit leader's cruel laughter echoing across the desert landscape. Canyon Ridge bustled with the kind of rough energy that both fascinated and intimidated her. Cowboys with weathered faces and dust-caked boots moved between the saloons and the general store, their spurs clicking against the wooden sidewalks. Women in practical calico dresses carried baskets of goods, their faces bearing the marks of hard frontier living, sun-weathered skin and knowing eyes that had seen too much hardship to be surprised by much of anything. The town itself sprawled along the base of Red Canyon walls that rose like ancient sentinels against the azure sky. False-fronted buildings lined the main street. Murphy's General Store, with its hand-painted sign and barrels of flour stacked outside, the Silver Dollar Saloon, where piano music drifted through bat-wing doors, even at this early hour, and the Canyon Ridge Hotel, a 2-story structure that represented the closest thing to luxury this frontier town could offer. Mrs. Martha Hendricks, the hotel proprietress, emerged from behind the front desk as Isabella entered. A woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, Martha had the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd carved out a respectable living in a man's world. Her eyes, however, held genuine warmth as she took in Isabella's disheveled appearance. "My dear child, you look like you've been through the devil's own trial," Martha said, her voice carrying the slight Irish accent she'd never quite lost, despite decades in America. "That big fellow who brought you in said there was trouble on the trail." Isabella nodded, still processing the morning's events. "Bandits," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "5 of them, maybe 6. They would have killed us all if not for—" She paused, realizing she didn't even know her rescuer's full name. "Gus McCall," Martha supplied with a knowing smile. "Garrison McCall, though nobody's called him that since his ma passed. Been looking after folks in these parts since he was barely grown. That boy's got the biggest heart to match his size." Through the hotel's front window, Isabella could see the man who'd saved her life, tending to his horse at the hitching post. Even from a distance, his imposing figure commanded attention. He stood well over 6 feet, 6'8", she'd guess, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world. His dark hair fell across his forehead as he worked, and despite his size, every movement carried a surprising gentleness. She watched as he stroked his horse's neck, murmuring words too. "Soft for her to hear. He's quite something, isn't he?" Martha observed, following Isabella's gaze. "Don't let that quiet way of his fool you. Gus has got more courage in his little finger than most men have in their whole bodies." Sheriff Tom Bradley pushed through the hotel's front door at that moment, his badge catching the light as he removed his hat. A lean man in his late 40s with a salt and pepper mustache, Bradley carried himself with the authority of someone who'd seen enough trouble to know when more was brewing. "Miss Fairchild, I need to get your statement about what happened out there," he said, his voice professional but kind. "And I want to hear about these bandits from someone who got a good look at them." Isabella spent the next hour recounting the attack in careful detail. She described the leader's distinctive scar running from his left temple to his jaw, the way he'd spoken with educated diction despite his criminal profession, and the cold calculation in his eyes when he'd given the order to kill everyone in the coach. Sheriff Bradley took careful notes, his expression growing more concerned with each detail. "That matches the description of Blackjack Morrison's gang," Bradley finally said, setting down his pencil. "They've been terrorizing folks between here and Santa Fe for the better part of 6 months. Your lucky Gus happened to be riding that stretch of trail." "Lucky seems inadequate," Isabella replied, thinking of how close death had come. "I offered to reward him, but he seemed almost embarrassed by the suggestion." Bradley chuckled. "That's Gus for you. Man saved more lives in this county than the rest of us combined, but he acts like it's nothing special. His pa was a cavalry officer, died fighting alongside Custer. His ma raised him alone until fever took her when Gus was 12. Old Pete Henderson's ranch hands took him in after that, taught him everything about surviving out here." As if summoned by their conversation, Gus appeared in the hotel doorway, his hat in his hands, and an expression of genuine concern on his weathered face. Up close, Isabella could see the details that distance had hidden, the kindness in his deep brown eyes, the way his massive hands held his hat with surprising delicacy, and the faint scar along his knuckles that spoke of hard work and harder. "Living, Miss Isabella," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in her chest. "I wanted to make sure you were settling in all right. This morning was, well, it wasn't the kind of welcome to Canyon Ridge anyone should have." Isabella felt her heart do something peculiar as she looked up at him. This giant of a man, who could probably break a horse with his bare hands, spoke to her with the same gentle courtesy her Boston finishing school instructors had drilled into reluctant debutantes. "I can never thank you enough for what you did," she said, meaning every word. "Truly, Mr. McCall, you saved my life and Jake's. If there's anything I can do to repay such kindness—" "Just Gus, ma'am," he interrupted softly, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. "And you don't owe me anything. Any decent person would have done the same." Isabella doubted that was true. In her experience, decent people were often in shorter supply than anyone cared to admit, but something about this man's humble sincerity made her want to honor his heroism properly. "Please," she insisted, surprising herself with her determination. "I was raised to believe that kindness should always be repaid with gratitude. My family has considerable means, and I'd like to offer you a proper reward for risking your life for strangers." Gus shifted uncomfortably, his large frame seeming almost too big for the hotel's modest lobby. "I appreciate the thought, Miss Isabella, but I truly don't need anything. Just knowing you and Jake are safe is reward enough." Isabella studied his face, seeing genuine discomfort at the idea of taking money for what he clearly considered simple human decency. An idea began forming in her mind, something that might allow her to honor his heroism while respecting his principles. "What if we made it more of a game?" she suggested, the words coming before she'd fully thought them through. "Something from the old fairy tales my grandmother used to tell. What if I granted you 3 wishes, anything your heart desires, as a token of my gratitude?" The suggestion hung in the air between them, and Isabella saw something flicker across Gus's face. Surprise, certainly, but also something deeper. a longing he quickly tried to hide. Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat and excused himself, sensing the conversation had taken a personal turn. 3 wishes, Gus repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Anything at all, Isabella confirmed, though she felt her cheeks warming slightly. Something about the way he was looking at her made the simple offer feel much more significant than she'd intended. Consider it a small way of honoring what you did today. Gus was quiet for a long moment, his brown eyes searching her face as if trying to determine whether she was serious. Finally, he nodded slowly. All right, Miss Isabella, he said, his voice carrying a note she couldn't quite identify. If it would make you feel better about what happened, I'll accept your 3 wishes. Wonderful, Isabella said, feeling unaccountably nervous. So what would you like for your first wish? Gus looked down at his hat, then back up at her, and Isabella saw something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. When he spoke, his words were simple, but they carried a weight that suggested depth she hadn't expected. I wish you'd let me teach you to shoot a gun, Miss Isabella. The request hit her like a physical blow, and Isabella felt her face flame with embarrassment. No man had ever suggested she needed protecting or additional skills beyond those deemed appropriate for a lady of her station. The idea that she might require such rough practical knowledge, and that this gentle giant thought her capable of learning it, left her completely flustered. That is, you want to teach me to shoot? She stammered, acutely aware of how her voice had risen in pitch. Gus nodded seriously. This country can be dangerous for someone who doesn't know how to defend themselves. What happened today proves that, if you're planning to stay in Canyon Ridge, you should know how to handle a firearm properly. Isabella's mind reeled. She'd expected him to ask for money, or perhaps help finding work, or any number of practical requests. She'd never imagined he would want to spend time teaching her such an intimate skill, for there was something undeniably intimate about the idea of his large, capable hands guiding hers, showing her how to hold a weapon, how to aim, how to protect herself. That is, ladies in Boston don't typically, she began, then stopped, realizing how ridiculous she sounded. I understand if it's not proper, Gus said quickly, misinterpreting her hesitation. I just thought, after today, you might want to know you could take care of yourself if needed. Isabella looked into his earnest face and realized he wasn't trying to embarrass her or suggest she was helpless. He was offering to share knowledge that might someday save her life, just as his courage had done today. The thoughtfulness behind the request made her embarrassment transform into something warmer and more complex. Yes, she heard herself saying. Yes, I think I would like that very much. The smile that spread across Gus's face was like sunrise, breaking over the canyon walls, transforming his entire expression and making Isabella's heart perform another one of those peculiar little skips. Tomorrow morning, then, he suggested, behind the hotel where it's quiet, I'll bring a suitable firearm and we can start with the basics. Isabella nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. As Gus replaced his hat and headed for the door, she caught sight of her reflection in the hotel's mirror. Her cheeks were still flushed, her eyes brighter than they'd been in months. Mrs. Hendricks appeared at her elbow, having observed the entire exchange with obvious interest. Well now, the older woman said with a knowing smile, that's the first time I've seen Gus McCall look so pleased about anything in years, and judging by that color in your cheeks, I'd say his first wish made quite an impression. Isabella touched her warm cheeks self-consciously. He caught me off guard, that's all. I expected him to ask for something more conventional. Gus has never been conventional, Martha replied, but he's got good instincts about people. If he thinks you should learn to shoot, it's probably worth listening to. This country has a way of testing folks, and it doesn't much care about proper Boston manners when the chips are down. As Isabella climbed the stairs to her room, she couldn't shake the feeling that accepting Gus's first wish had set something in motion, something that would change her far more than a simple shooting lesson ever could. The emerald brooch at her throat seemed to catch every ray of light, as if reflecting the unexpected brightness this giant, gentle man had brought into her carefully ordered world. Outside her window, she could see Gus mounting his horse, his movements fluid despite his size. Tomorrow, those same hands that had saved her life would teach her to defend herself. The thought should have been purely practical, but Isabella found her heart beating just a little faster as she watched him ride away into the gathering dusk. The attack had happened so quickly that Isabella's mind struggled to piece together the sequence of events even hours later. She sat in her hotel room as twilight painted the canyon walls purple, trying to make sense of the terror that had nearly claimed her life. It had started as such an ordinary morning. Jake Morrison, her hired driver, had been whistling an old cavalry tune as their stagecoach rolled along the dusty trail toward Canyon Ridge. The desert landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by clusters of sagebrush and the occasional Joshua tree reaching toward the cloudless sky. Isabella had been reviewing the papers regarding her inheritance, her great-uncle's ranch, and the substantial debts that came with it, when Jake's whistling stopped abruptly. "Miss Isabella," he'd called back to her, his voice tight with concern. "We got company coming up fast behind us." She'd looked out the small rear window to see 5 riders gaining ground, their faces hidden behind bandanas and their intent unmistakably hostile. The thunder of hoofbeats grew louder as they closed the distance, and Isabella's educated mind grasped immediately that this was no chance encounter. "Can we outrun them?" she'd called to Jake, already knowing the answer. Their heavy coach, loaded with her trunks and supplies, could never match the speed of individual horses across open terrain. "Not likely, miss," Jake had replied, reaching for the rifle secured beneath his seat. "But I'll do my best to—" The first shot had shattered the morning air like breaking glass. Isabella heard Jake cry out, saw him slump forward as blood bloomed across his shoulder. The coach veered wildly as the horses, panicked by the gunfire, broke into a frenzied gallop. The bandit leader had pulled alongside the runaway coach then, his horse matching pace with practiced ease. Through the window, Isabella caught her first clear look at him, a man of perhaps 35, with cold blue eyes above his bandana and a distinctive scar running from his left temple down to his jaw. What struck her most was his voice when he shouted orders to his men. Unlike the rough drawl she'd expected from an outlaw, he spoke with the refined diction of an educated man. "Bring them to a stop," he'd commanded. "I want them alive for now." 2 of his men had ridden ahead to block the trail while the others flanked the coach. When the terrified horses finally came to a halt, Isabella found herself surrounded by armed men whose intentions were written clearly in their predatory stares. "Well, well," the scarred leader had said, dismounting with fluid grace. "What have we here? A fine Eastern lady traveling through our territory without paying the proper toll." Isabella had forced herself to remain calm, drawing on years of dealing with difficult business associates in Boston. "I'm Isabella Fairchild, traveling to Canyon Ridge on legitimate business. I carry enough money to pay reasonable passage fees." The leader's laugh had been devoid of warmth. "Oh, Miss Fairchild, I'm afraid you misunderstand the nature of our toll. We don't want your pocket money." He'd approached the coach then, and Isabella saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. This wasn't simple robbery. This man intended to kill her, and he was going to enjoy doing it. "You see," he'd continued conversationally, "we've been watching the trail for someone exactly like you. Wealthy, traveling alone, unlikely to be missed for days." His hand rested casually on his gun. "Your death will send a message to other fancy folks who think they can just waltz through our territory." Jake had tried to raise his rifle despite his wounded shoulder, but one of the other bandits struck him down with a vicious blow that left him motionless on the ground. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized no help was coming. They were alone on this desolate stretch of trail, and these men were going to murder them both. "Any last words, Miss Fairchild?" the leader had asked, drawing his pistol with theatrical flourish. That's when the ground had begun to tremble. At first, Isabella thought it was another group of riders, but the sound was different, heavier, more focused. Then she saw him cresting, the small rise to the east, and her breath caught in her throat. Garrison McCall rode like something out of legend, his massive frame somehow perfectly balanced on his black stallion. Even at a distance, his presence was overwhelming. 6'8" of muscle and determination bearing down on them like an avalanche given human form. His hat was pulled low over his eyes, and something in his posture suggested he'd assessed the situation and found it wanting. The bandits noticed him too, but they seemed more amused than concerned. 5 armed men against 1 lone rider seemed like favorable odds, even if that rider was unusually large. "Looks like we got ourselves a hero," one of them called out with a laugh. The scarred leader kept his gun trained on Isabella, but turned to watch Gus's approach. "Ride on, big man," he shouted. "This doesn't concern you." Gus had reined in his horse about 50 yards away, well within rifle range, but far enough to avoid immediate threat. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the desert air, with quiet authority that seemed to resonate in Isabella's chest. "I'm afraid it does concern me," he said simply. "You're threatening innocent people." The bandit leader's scarred face twisted with cruel amusement. "Innocent? This fancy lady probably has more money than any of us will see in a lifetime, and you're worried about her being innocent." "Her money's got nothing to do with it," Gus replied, and Isabella heard something in his tone that made her shiver despite the heat. "You're pointing guns at folks who can't defend themselves. That makes it my business." What happened next occurred so quickly that Isabella's mind could barely follow the sequence. The bandit leader, clearly growing tired of the conversation, swung his pistol toward Gus while barking orders to his men. But Gus had been expecting that move. His horse surged forward like a battering ram, covering the distance in seconds. Gus's right hand drew his revolver with fluid precision, while his left guided his mount directly into the cluster of surprised bandits. His first shot took down the man threatening Jake before the bandit could even raise his weapon. The remaining 4 scattered, trying to bring their guns to bear on this unexpected threat. But Gus used his horse's bulk and his own imposing size to create chaos in their ranks. He seemed to anticipate their movements, always positioning himself between them and clear shots at Isabella. One bandit tried to circle behind him, but Gus wheeled his horse with surprising agility, his boot catching the man square in the chest and sending him flying backward into a cluster of sagebrush. Another raised his rifle, only to find Gus's massive frame bearing down on him like divine retribution. The scarred leader, realizing his advantage had evaporated, made a desperate grab for Isabella through the coach window. His fingers had just closed around her wrist when Gus's voice boomed across the battlefield. "Let her go." The simple command carried such absolute authority that the bandit leader actually hesitated. In that moment of uncertainty, Gus struck. He vaulted from his saddle with athletic grace that seemed impossible for a man his size, landing behind the leader and wrapping one enormous arm around the man's throat. "I said let her go," Gus repeated, his voice deadly quiet. The remaining bandits, seeing their leader captured and 2 of their number down, made the practical decision to flee. They mounted their horses and rode hard toward the horizon, leaving their leader to face this gentle giant alone. Gus held the scarred man for a moment longer, then released him with a shove that sent him stumbling toward his horse. "Take your men and get out of here," he commanded. "If I see you threatening innocent folks again, we'll finish this conversation in a way you won't enjoy." The bandit leader's eyes burned with humiliation and rage, but he was outnumbered and outmatched. As he mounted his horse, he pulled something in from his shirt pocket, a silver locket that caught the sunlight, and held it up so Isabella could see it clearly. "This isn't over," he snarled, his educated voice now thick with fury. "Tell Canyon Ridge that Blackjack Morrison remembers his debts." Then he was gone, spurring his horse after his fleeing men and leaving only dust and the echo of hoofbeats behind. Isabella sat in stunned silence as Gus checked on Jake, whose shoulder wound was painful but not life-threatening. The gentle way. This giant man bandaged the injury and helped Jake back onto the driver's seat, spoke of extensive experience with frontier medicine and violence. "Are you hurt, Miss Isabella?" Gus asked, his brown eyes scanning her face with genuine concern. "No," she managed, though her hands were shaking. "Thanks to you, I'm perfectly fine." But even as she spoke the words, Isabella knew they weren't entirely true. She wasn't hurt physically, but something fundamental had shifted inside her during those terrifying minutes. She'd stared death in the face and been saved by a man whose courage and skill were matched only by his obvious desire to protect others. As they resumed their journey to Canyon Ridge, Isabella found herself studying Gus's broad back as he rode, alongside their coach. The silver locket the bandit leader had displayed nagged at her memory, but she couldn't place why it seemed familiar. What she did know was that she owed this remarkable man her life, and simple gratitude seemed inadequate for such a debt. The 3 wishes she'd offered felt like a small beginning, but even that gesture had surprised her with its intimate implications. His first request echoed in her mind as the canyon walls of their destination came into view. "I wish you'd let me teach you to shoot a gun, Miss Isabella." The idea still made her cheeks burn, but now it carried additional weight. She'd been helpless during the attack, completely dependent on others for her survival. If Gus wanted to change that, if he believed she was capable of learning to defend herself, then perhaps it was time to discover what other assumptions about her capabilities might need reconsidering. The emerald brooch at her throat caught the afternoon light as Canyon Ridge welcomed them with its dusty streets and rough-hewn buildings. Isabella touched the family heirloom thoughtfully, realizing that the pampered Boston heiress who'd left the hotel that morning was already beginning to transform into someone new, someone who just might be worthy of the faith a gentle giant had shown in her. Isabella's leather-bound journal lay open on the small writing desk in her hotel room, her fountain pen poised above pages that remained stubbornly blank. 3 days had passed since the attack, and she'd attempted multiple times to record her thoughts about the experience, but every time she began writing about Gus McCall, her normally eloquent prose dissolved into scattered impressions and half-formed emotions. "He moves like water despite his size," she'd written, then crossed out. "His hands are surprisingly gentle for someone so powerful," followed by another frustrated deletion. How could she possibly capture the complexity of a man who'd saved her life with violence, yet spoke to her with such tender courtesy? A knock at her door interrupted her literary struggles. "Miss Isabella, it's Martha. That young man is here for your shooting lesson." Isabella's stomach performed an unexpected somersault. She'd been anticipating this moment with equal parts excitement and nervousness since accepting Gus's first wish. The practical part of her mind recognized the wisdom in learning to defend herself, especially after witnessing her complete helplessness during the bandit attack. But the woman in her, the part that noticed how his brown eyes crinkled when he smiled and how her pulse quickened whenever he spoke her name, was far more interested in spending time alone with him. She closed the journal and smoothed her riding skirt, chosen specifically for its practical design rather than fashionable appeal. The deep blue fabric was sturdy enough for outdoor activities, while still maintaining some semblance of propriety. She'd even borrowed a pair of leather gloves from Martha to protect her hands, though she suspected her soft Boston palms would protest regardless. Gus waited behind the hotel in a small clearing that offered both privacy and safety for firearms practice. He'd positioned several empty bottles on a fallen log about 20 yards away, and a well-worn rifle case lay open beside a weathered blanket spread on the ground. When he saw her approaching, his face lit with that sunrise smile that never failed to affect her breathing. "Good morning, Miss Isabella," he said, removing his hat in a gesture that struck her as both old-fashioned and endearing. "I hope you slept well, despite everything that's happened." "Well enough," she replied, though in truth she'd spent considerable time lying awake thinking about him. "I must admit, I'm nervous about this. Ladies in Boston are generally discouraged from handling weapons of any kind." Gus nodded, understanding. "That's natural. Most folks are nervous their first time, but you've got a good mind and steady hands. I could tell that from watching you during the attack. You didn't panic even when things looked bad." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. "You were rather magnificent yourself," she said, then immediately felt her cheeks color. Such direct praise wasn't considered proper from a lady to a gentleman, but something about Gus's unpretentious manner made formal social rules seem artificial. "I was just doing what needed doing," he replied with characteristic modesty. "Now, let's see about teaching you to do the same." He lifted a smaller rifle from the case, still substantial by Isabella's standards, but more manageable than the massive weapon she'd expected. "This belonged to my mother," he explained, his voice taking on a softer tone. "She was raised on a ranch in Texas and could outshoot most of the men in 3 counties. My father always said she was the strongest person he ever knew." Isabella accepted the rifle carefully, surprised by its weight and the smoothness of the wooden stock. Someone had cared for this weapon with obvious devotion, and knowing it had belonged to Gus's mother made holding it feel like a privilege rather than a burden. "The first thing to understand," Gus said, moving to stand behind her, "is that shooting isn't about force or aggression. It's about focus, breathing, and patience. A lot like the skills you probably use in business, actually." His proximity sent an unexpected thrill through her. She could feel the warmth radiating from his large frame and catch the scent of leather and pine that seemed to follow him everywhere. When his hands gently adjusted her grip on the rifle, her concentration scattered like startled birds. "Like this," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear as he positioned her fingers, firm but not tight. "The weapon should feel like an extension of your arms, not something you're fighting against." Isabella tried to focus on his instruction, but the sensation of his strong hands guiding hers made coherent thought surprisingly difficult. No man had ever touched her so casually, and certainly not for such a practical purpose. The intimate nature of the lesson, his body partially sheltering hers, his voice low and encouraging in her ear, created a tension she'd never experienced before. "Now sight down the barrel," Gus continued, apparently unaware of her internal turmoil. "See that notch at the end? Line it up with the bottle you want to hit, but don't force it. Let your eye find the natural alignment." Isabella tried to follow his guidance, but her hands trembled slightly with nerves and something else she couldn't quite name. The target seemed impossibly small and distant, and she had no idea how anyone could hit such a tiny mark with any consistency. "I can't seem to hold it steady," she admitted, frustration creeping into her voice. "That's normal," Gus assured her. "Here, let me help." He stepped closer, his chest against her back as his arms came around her to support the rifle's weight. Isabella's breath caught as she found herself essentially embraced by this gentle giant, his strength and warmth surrounding her completely. "Better?" he asked, his voice rumbling in his chest where it pressed against her shoulders. "Much," she managed, though whether she was referring to the shooting stance or simply the unexpected pleasure of being held by him remained unclear. From this supported position, the rifle did feel more manageable. Isabella found she could sight down the barrel without the trembling that had plagued her earlier attempts. The bottle target seemed closer now, more achievable. "When you're ready," Gus said softly, "take a deep breath, let half of it out. Then squeeze the trigger slowly. Don't jerk it, just apply steady pressure until the weapon fires." Isabella followed his instructions, feeling his strength steadying her as she focused on the target. The world seemed to narrow to just the bottle, the rifle's sight, and the solid presence of the man behind her. She squeezed the trigger as he'd instructed, and the rifle's report echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. The bottle exploded in a shower of glass fragments. "Well, I'll be," Gus said, genuine amazement in his voice. "That was a perfect shot for a first attempt. You're a natural marksman, Miss Isabella." Isabella stared at the destroyed target in shock. She'd actually hit. It not only hit it, but shattered it completely. The sense of accomplishment was unlike anything she'd ever experienced, a combination of pride and power that made her understand why men found such satisfaction in mastering difficult skills. "I did it," she said wonderingly, then turned in Gus's arms to face him. "I actually hit the target." Her excitement made her forget their intimate positioning until she found herself looking up into his brown eyes from mere inches away. His hands still supported her arms, and she could see the warmth and pride in his expression as he smiled down at her. "You surely did," he confirmed, his voice slightly rougher than usual. "I knew you had it in you." For a moment, they remained, frozen in that position, and Isabella became acutely aware of how improper their closeness would appear to any observer. She should step away, restore proper distance between them. But something in his gaze held her motionless. "Gus," she whispered, not even sure what she intended to say. "Miss Isabella," he replied, his voice soft and wondering, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. The sound of approaching voices broke the spell. Gus immediately stepped back, putting respectable distance between them, while Isabella busied herself examining the rifle to hide her flushed cheeks. Sheriff Bradley rounded the corner of the hotel with two of his deputies, their expressions serious enough to suggest official business rather than a social call. "Gus, Miss Fairchild," Bradley nodded to them both. "Sorry to interrupt, but we've got a problem. Morrison's gang hit the Hendricks place last night. Nobody was hurt, but they left a message carved into the front door. Tell the fancy lady we're not finished." Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. The bandit leader's parting words echoed in her memory. This isn't over. She'd hoped his threat was merely wounded pride speaking, but apparently Blackjack Morrison was a man who kept his promises. "They're coming after me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Looks that way," Bradley confirmed grimly, "which means we need to talk about your safety arrangements. This town's got good people, but we're not equipped to fight off a determined gang." Gus's expression had transformed during this exchange, the gentle instructor replaced by someone far more dangerous. "She'll be safe," he said quietly, but his tone carried absolute conviction. "I give you my word on that." Isabella looked between the two men, recognizing that her shooting lesson had just become much more than an educational exercise. In a matter of days, she'd gone from pampered heiress to target of a vengeful outlaw gang. The rifle in her hands no longer felt like a curiosity, it felt like a necessity. Her journal entry that evening would be considerably more coherent than her earlier attempts. She had definite thoughts to record now, thoughts about courage and protection and the way a man's promise could make her feel both vulnerable and stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. The hand-carved wooden horse sat on Isabella's windowsill, catching the morning light in its polished curves and detailed mane. Gus had left it there the previous evening with a note written in surprisingly elegant script. "For protection and good dreams. Something my father taught me. Horses bring luck to travelers." Isabella turned the small figure in her hands, marveling at the intricate craftsmanship. Every detail was perfect, from the flowing tail to the alert ears, carved with a patience and skill that spoke of countless quiet hours spent perfecting the work. It was beautiful in its simplicity, but more than that, it revealed yet another, a layer to the complex man who'd created it. She'd discovered quite a few unexpected facets to Gus McCall over the past week. During their second shooting lesson, conducted under Sheriff Bradley's watchful eye this time, she'd witnessed his remarkable patience as he guided her through increasingly difficult targets. When young Tommy Patterson had run up crying about his lost puppy, Gus had spent an hour helping the boy search, his massive frame moving with surprising gentleness through brush and rocks until the missing animal was found. Most surprising of all had been the evening she'd found him in the hotel's modest library, reading a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets with the same focused attention most men reserved for newspaper accounts of cattle prices and weather reports. "You read poetry?" she'd asked, unable to hide her amazement. "My mother taught me," he'd replied, that characteristic blush coloring his cheeks. "She said a man's mind needed beauty just as much as his body needed food. I'm probably not understanding it right, but I like the way the words sound." Isabella had sat beside him then, sharing her own love of literature, and they'd spent an hour discussing everything from Shakespeare to the novels of Jane Austen. His insights were thoughtful and surprisingly sophisticated, revealing an intelligence that formal education had never had the chance to refine, but which natural curiosity had kept sharp. Now, 3 days after the sheriff's warning about Morrison's continued threats, Isabella found herself thinking about Gus's complexity while reviewing the devastating financial records of her inherited ranch. The Fairchild property sprawled across nearly 1,000 acres of prime grazing land, but her great-uncle's final years had been marked by poor decisions and failing health. The debts were staggering, enough to force a sale unless she could find some way to make the ranch profitable again. She'd originally planned to liquidate everything and return to Boston with whatever proceeds remained. But something about Canyon Ridge was making that option feel less appealing with each passing day. Perhaps it was the stunning beauty of the landscape, or the genuine warmth of people like Martha Hendricks and Sheriff Bradley. Or perhaps it was the way a certain gentle giant made her feel more alive and capable than she'd ever felt in her carefully constructed Boston life. A knock at her door interrupted her brooding. "Come in," she called, expecting Martha with afternoon tea. Instead, Gus entered, his hat in his hands and his expression serious. "Miss Isabella, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. Sheriff Bradley asked me to check on you, make sure you're settling in all right." "Of course not," she replied, hastily gathering the financial papers. "Please sit down. Would you like some coffee?" "That's kind of you, but I can't stay long." He settled his large frame into the room's single chair, which creaked ominously. Under his weight, "I wanted to talk to you about the ranch situation." Isabella's eyebrows rose in surprise. "What do you know about my ranch situation?" "Word travels fast in a small town," Gus said with an apologetic smile. "Folks are saying you might not keep the property. I was hoping actually, that maybe I could help somehow." "Help how?" Isabella asked, genuinely curious. "Well, I know that land pretty well. Used to ride fence for your great-uncle when I was younger, before his health started failing. The property's got good bones, plenty of water, excellent grazing, solid buildings that just need some attention. With the right management, it could be profitable again." Isabella studied his earnest face, recognizing genuine concern rather than mere politeness. "The debts are quite substantial, Gus. I'm not sure good bones are enough to overcome poor financial management." "Maybe not," he agreed. "But I was thinking, if you decided to keep the place, I could help with the repairs and improvements. I know construction work, animal husbandry, land management. I've been learning ranching since I was 12 years old." The offer was generous beyond measure, but Isabella sensed something deeper behind his words. "Why would you want to do that? Surely you have your own work, your own plans." Gus was quiet for a long moment, his large hands turning his hat in slow circles. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and slightly uncertain. "I suppose this is as good a time as any for my second wish." Isabella's heart did that peculiar little skip it always performed when he mentioned the wishes. "Your second wish? I wish you'd tell me about your life back east," he said, his brown eyes meeting hers with unexpected intensity. "Not the facts. I know you're wealthy and educated, and probably have a dozen suitors waiting for you to come home. I want to know about you. What makes you happy? What you dream about? Whether you ever feel as lonely in a crowd of people as I do sometimes." The request hit her like a physical blow, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was so deeply personal. No one in Boston had ever asked her such questions. Her suitors had been interested in her fortune and social connections. Her family in her dutiful compliance with their expectations, her friends in the superficial pleasantries that passed for intimacy in polite society. "That's quite a question," she managed, her voice slightly unsteady. "I know it's presumptuous," Gus said quickly. "But after what happened with those bandits, and spending time teaching you to shoot and talking about books the other evening, I feel like I'm seeing the real you for the first time. And I'd like to know more about that person, if you're willing to share." Isabella rose from her chair and moved to the window, looking out at the canyon walls that had become familiar and comforting over the past weeks. The vulnerability in his request both frightened and attracted her. Telling him the truth would mean admitting things she'd barely acknowledged to herself. "My life in Boston is very predictable," she began slowly. "Charity committees and social functions, managing a portion of the family textile business, entertaining. Suitable gentlemen who see me more as a business arrangement than a person. I have everything a woman of my station is supposed to want: wealth, position, security, but," Gus prompted gently, "but I've never felt truly useful," Isabella admitted, the words coming easier now. "Never felt like I was making any real difference in the world. I'm 26 years old, and I've never done anything that mattered. Never tested myself against genuine challenges, never even known if I was capable of real courage until those bandits forced me to find out." She turned to face him, struck by the genuine interest in his expression. "I spent my entire childhood being told I was fragile and needed protection, that my value lay in being ornamental rather than useful. Coming here, learning to shoot, dealing with the ranch problems, it's the first time I've felt like I might actually be capable of building something meaningful." "And the loneliness?" Gus asked softly. Isabella felt her cheeks warm. "It's possible to be surrounded by people and still feel completely isolated, especially when no one seems interested in who you really are underneath all the social expectations." Gus rose from his chair and moved to stand near the window, careful to maintain proper distance but close enough that she could see the warmth in his eyes. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I think the person you really are is pretty remarkable. Brave enough to travel west alone, smart enough to handle complex business affairs, kind enough to offer wishes to a stranger, and strong enough to learn skills most ladies wouldn't even consider. Any man who can't see that isn't worth your time." The compliment hung in the air between them, more meaningful than any flowery praise Isabella had ever received from her Boston suitors. There was no calculation behind it, no attempt to flatter for personal gain, just honest appreciation from a man whose own character she'd come to respect deeply. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you probably realize." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both aware that something significant had shifted between them. Finally, Gus cleared his throat and returned to his earlier topic. "So, about the ranch," he said, his practical nature reasserting itself. "If you decided to stay and try to make it work, you wouldn't have to do it alone. I meant what I said about helping." Isabella looked at the wooden horse on her windowsill, then back at the man who'd carved it with such obvious care. The idea of staying in Canyon Ridge, of trying to build something meaningful with her life, seemed less impossible when she imagined having Gus's strength and knowledge to rely on. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "The decision affects more than just me now." Gus's smile was radiant. "That's all I can ask for. And Miss Isabella, I'm glad you told me about your life back east. It helps me understand why you seem so determined to prove yourself out here." After he left, Isabella returned to her financial papers with renewed focus. The numbers were still daunting, but they no longer seemed insurmountable. Perhaps what the ranch needed wasn't just better management. Perhaps it needed someone who understood that the most valuable things in life couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. She picked up her fountain pen and began making notes in the margins, her mind already working on possibilities she'd never considered before. Outside her window, the wooden horse caught the afternoon light like a promise of adventures yet to come. The faded photograph of the Fairchild ranch in its prime lay spread across the kitchen table of the ranch house, its edges worn soft from years of handling. Isabella traced her finger along the image of the main house as it had appeared 20 years ago, freshly painted, surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings and neat pastures dotted with healthy cattle. The contrast with the reality that surrounded her now was stark and sobering. The ranch house she'd inherited bore little resemblance to the photograph's promise. Paint peeled from weathered boards, several windows were cracked or missing entirely, and the front porch sagged under the weight of neglect. The barn roof had partially collapsed during the previous winter, and the fencing that had once kept the property's boundaries clear now lay in tangled heaps across overgrown fields. "It's going to take a lot of work," Gus said quietly from beside her, his large frame nearly filling the cramped kitchen. "But the foundation is solid, and the well still runs clear. Your great-uncle built this place to last. It just needs someone who cares about it again." Isabella nodded, though her practical Boston mind calculated the enormous expense of restoration. They'd ridden out to survey the property together at dawn, and every hour had revealed new problems requiring attention. The scope of work needed seemed overwhelming for someone with no ranching experience and limited funds. The cattle operation could be profitable again, Gus continued, apparently reading her discouragement. "The grazing land is some of the best in this part of the territory, and that creek running through the south pasture means water, even during dry years. That's worth more than gold out here." Isabella appreciated his optimism, but the financial reality remained daunting. "Even if the land has potential, I'd need to buy livestock, repair buildings, hire hands, purchase equipment. The initial investment would be enormous." "Maybe not as enormous as you think," Gus said, pulling a piece of paper from his shirt pocket. "I took the liberty of working up some numbers based on what I know about ranching operations." Isabella accepted the paper, surprised by the neat columns of figures and detailed cost projections. His calculations were thorough and realistic, accounting for everything from lumber costs to veterinary expenses. More importantly, they suggested that the ranch could become profitable within 3 years if managed properly. "You did all this research?" she asked, genuinely impressed. Gus's cheeks colored slightly. "I've been thinking about it since our conversation yesterday. I know you're used to making important decisions based on solid information, so I wanted to give you the facts as best I could figure them." Isabella studied the projections more carefully, her business training automatically checking his assumptions and calculations. His work was remarkably sophisticated for someone without formal education, showing an intuitive understanding of profit margins and cash flow that many of her Boston associates would envy. "These numbers assume I'd have experienced help managing the operation," she observed. "Yes, ma'am," Gus confirmed. "Good ranch management makes the difference between success and failure out here. You'd need someone who knows cattle, understands land management, can handle the physical work, and make quick decisions when problems arise." Isabella looked up from the paper to find him watching her intently. "Someone like you? I'd be honored to help," he said simply. "If you decided to stay and try to make this work, I mean. I know it's a big risk for someone with your background." The offer was generous beyond measure, but Isabella sensed it represented more than simple neighborly assistance. Working together to restore the ranch would mean spending considerable time alone, sharing the intimate daily challenges of building something from nothing. The implications of such an arrangement, for both her reputation and her heart, were not lost on her. "That's an incredibly generous offer," she said carefully, "but I have to ask, why would you want to tie yourself to such an uncertain venture? You have your own life, your own opportunities." Gus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the photograph of the ranch in its prime. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability that made Isabella's chest tighten. "I've been drifting for most of my adult life," he admitted, "helping other people build their dreams, working their land, protecting their families. Never really had anything of my own to care about, never found a reason to put down roots anywhere. He turned to meet her gaze, and Isabella saw something in his brown eyes that made her breath catch. This place, working with you to bring it back to life. It feels like the first chance I've ever had to build something that matters, something I could be proud of. The honesty in his words hit her like a physical blow. Isabella realized that while she'd been thinking about the practical challenges of ranch management, Gus had been envisioning something much deeper, a partnership that went beyond simple business arrangements. "Gus," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the emotions his confession had stirred. "I know it's presumptuous," he said quickly, misinterpreting her hesitation. "You're a lady with education and means, and I'm just a ranch hand with more muscle than sense. But I thought maybe—" "Stop!" Isabella interrupted firmly. "Don't you dare diminish yourself that way. You're one of the most intelligent, capable, honorable men I've ever met. Any woman would be fortunate to have your partnership in anything." The silence that followed her words was charged with unspoken possibilities. Isabella found herself studying Gus's strong profile, remembering the gentle way he'd taught her to shoot, the patience he'd shown with frightened children, the artistic skill evident in the wooden horse he'd carved. This man was nothing like the shallow suitors who'd pursued her in Boston, and everything like the partner she'd never dared to dream she might find. "The ranch work would be hard," she said finally. "Harder than anything I've ever attempted. And the financial risk is considerable." "Yes, ma'am," Gus agreed. "But the best things in life usually require taking chances on something you believe in." Isabella looked around the rundown kitchen, trying to imagine it restored to its former glory. With proper care, the house could be beautiful again, warm and welcoming, filled with the sounds of productive life. The idea of creating such a place, of proving she could build something meaningful with her own hands and determination, was intoxicating. "If I decided to try this," she said slowly, "I'd want everything done properly. Fair wages for anyone who helps, legal contracts, proper accounting of all expenses and profits. Naturally," Gus nodded, "you'd be the owner, making all the important decisions. I'd just be—" "My partner," Isabella finished, the word feeling significant in ways that had nothing to do with business arrangements. "If we're going to rebuild this place, we should do it as equal partners." Gus's eyes widened with surprise and something that looked very much like hope. "Partner, you provide the expertise and labor. I provide the capital and business management. We split whatever profits the ranch generates." Isabella found herself warming to the idea, even as she spoke. It would be unconventional, certainly, but it seems fair given what each of us would contribute. "Miss Isabella, that's incredibly generous, but I couldn't accept—" "Yes, you could," she said firmly. "And you should. Partnership means shared risk and shared reward. If this venture fails, we both lose. If it succeeds, we both benefit." Isabella stood and walked to the broken window, looking out at the overgrown pastures where cattle had once grazed peacefully. In her mind's eye, she could see the ranch as it might be again, productive, profitable, alive with purpose. "Besides," she added with a smile, "I suspect I'm going to need all the help I can get learning to manage livestock and crops. Having a partner who actually knows what he's doing seems like sound business sense." Gus joined her at the window, his presence both comforting and unsettling in its intensity. "You're serious about this? About staying and trying to make it work?" "I think I am," Isabella admitted, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "For the first time in my life, I have the chance to build something meaningful from the ground up. It's terrifying and exhilarating and completely impractical, but yes, I think I want to try." The smile that spread across Gus's face was brilliant enough to power the town's generator. "In that case, partner, I'd say we have a lot of work ahead of us." Isabella laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "When do we start?" "How about now?" Gus suggested, pulling a carpenter's pencil from his pocket. "We could walk through the house and barn, make a list of the most urgent repairs, get a real sense of what we're taking on. For the next 2 hours, they moved through the property together, Gus explaining structural issues, while Isabella took careful notes. His knowledge was encyclopedic. He knew which beams needed replacing, where the roof leaked, how to restore the well pump, and which sections of fence could be salvaged versus rebuilt. More than his expertise, Isabella found herself drawn to his vision for the property's potential. He spoke about the ranch, not as it was, but as it could become, his enthusiasm infectious as he described plans for expanding the cattle operation and improving the grazing systems. Working beside him felt natural in a way that surprised her. Their different backgrounds, her formal education and his practical experience, complemented each other perfectly. Where she saw financial opportunities, he understood logistical challenges. Where he identified physical problems, she calculated cost-effective solutions. As the afternoon sun began casting long shadows across the valley, Isabella realized that something fundamental had shifted during their planning session. She was no longer a Boston heiress playing at frontier life. She was a woman making serious plans for her future, with a partner whose respect and trust meant more to her than all the social approval her old life had offered. "We should head back to town before dark," Gus suggested, gathering the tools he'd brought for their survey. "But I think we accomplished a lot today." Isabella nodded, looking once more at the photograph of the ranch in its prime. Soon, if their plans succeeded, new photographs would capture the property's restored glory and perhaps document the beginning of something even more significant than successful cattle ranching. The ride back to Canyon Ridge was peaceful, both of them lost in thoughts about the ambitious project they'd committed to undertaking. Isabella found herself stealing glances at Gus's profile, wondering if he understood that their partnership would likely transform more than just the ranch's fortunes. As they reached the town's outskirts, Isabella touched the photograph tucked safely in her saddlebag. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Gus's mother's wedding ring lay hidden in the bottom of his saddlebags, wrapped in a piece of soft leather that had protected it through countless miles of frontier travel. He'd carried it for over 15 years, without ever imagining he might have reason to use it. But lately, the simple gold band had begun to feel less like a memento and more like a possibility. The transformation had begun 3 weeks ago, when Isabella made her decision to stay and restore the ranch. Working alongside her each day had revealed depths to her character that he'd only glimpsed during their shooting lessons and evening conversations. She was proving to be remarkably adaptable, throwing herself into the hard work of ranch restoration with determination that impressed even the most skeptical townspeople. This morning, as dawn painted the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold, Gus found Isabella already at work in the ranch house kitchen, her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back in a practical style that bore no resemblance to the elegant coiffures she'd worn upon arriving in Canyon Ridge. She was scrubbing years of grime from the wide plank floors, her movements efficient and purposeful. "You're an early riser," he observed, setting down the toolbox he'd brought for the day's repairs. "Old habits," Isabella replied with a smile that made his chest tighten. "My father always said the most productive people were the ones who greeted each day before it was fully awake." Gus had learned to treasure these casual references to her past, the small revelations that helped him understand the experiences that had shaped her. Over the past weeks, she'd shared stories of her childhood in Boston, her struggles to find meaningful work within the constraints of society's expectations, and her growing certainty that Canyon Ridge represented more than just a temporary adventure. "What's the plan for today?" Isabella asked, pushing a stray curl behind her ear with the back of her hand. "I thought we'd start on the main bedroom," Gus replied, trying not to notice how the morning light caught the gold highlights in her brown hair. "The floorboards are solid, but the walls need patching and the window frame is rotting out." Working together had become a comfortable routine, their different skills complementing each other in ways that made even the most challenging tasks feel manageable. Isabella's attention to detail and organizational abilities kept their projects moving efficiently, while Gus's carpentry skills and physical strength handled the heavy construction work. As they worked side by side repairing the bedroom walls, their conversation drifted to topics that went far beyond immediate ranch concerns. Isabella shared her thoughts about the books she'd been reading, her observations about frontier life, and her growing appreciation for the way people in Canyon Ridge looked after each other. Gus found himself opening up about his dreams for the ranch's future, his memories of his parents, and his gradually developing sense that he might finally have found where he belonged. "Tell me about your mother," Isabella said during a break in their work, settling beside him on the porch steps with 2 cups of coffee. "You mention her often, but always in passing." Gus was quiet for a moment, gathering words for memories that still carried emotional weight after all these years. "She was the strongest person I ever knew," he finally said. "Lost her first husband in the war, raised my older brother alone until she met my father. When he died at Little Bighorn, she didn't fall apart like everyone expected. She just kept going, kept building the life she wanted. That's where you get your resilience," Isabella observed softly. "Maybe," Gus agreed. "She always said that strength wasn't about never being afraid or hurt. It was about deciding that your dreams mattered more than your fears." Isabella's expression grew thoughtful. "I think I'm just learning that lesson myself. 3 months ago, the idea of manual labor or financial risk would have terrified me. Now here I am, rebuilding a ranch and wondering why I waited so long to discover what I was really capable of." The pride in her voice made Gus's heart swell. Watching Isabella discover her own capabilities had been one of the greatest privileges of his life. She'd proven surprisingly strong and remarkably quick to learn practical skills that her privileged upbringing had never required. More than that, she'd shown a determination and courage that commanded the respect of everyone in Canyon Ridge. "You've surprised a lot of people," Gus said. "Including yourself, I think." "Especially myself," Isabella agreed with a laugh. "Mrs. Hendricks says the whole town is betting on whether I'll last through winter or run back to Boston at the first sign of snow. What do you think?" Gus asked, though he dreaded the possibility that she might still choose to leave. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the valley that spread below the ranch house. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a certainty that made Gus's pulse quicken. "I think I've never felt more at home anywhere in my life," she said simply. "Boston was where I was born, but this feels like where I belong." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. Gus felt the weight of his mother's ring in his pocket, the symbol of hopes he'd barely dared to acknowledge even to himself. "I'm glad," he said finally, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "The ranch needs someone who'll care about it the way you do." "It's not just the ranch," Isabella said softly, then seemed to catch herself before saying more. Their eyes met and held, and Gus felt the same electric tension that had been building between them for weeks. The practical work of restoration had created countless opportunities for casual contact, steadying each other on ladders, passing tools, working together in confined spaces, and each touch had intensified the growing attraction neither could deny. "Isabella," he began, then stopped as the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the spell. Sheriff Bradley rode into the ranch yard, his expression grim enough to suggest serious trouble. Behind him rode 2 of his deputies, and all 3 men bore the tense alertness of lawmen expecting violence. "Gus, Miss Fairchild," Bradley called out as he dismounted. "We've got a problem. Morrison's gang hit the Martinez place last night, burned out the family, killed most of their livestock." Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. The Martinez ranch was only 15 miles away, close enough to suggest that Blackjack Morrison was tightening his circle around Canyon Ridge. "Anyone hurt?" Gus asked, his entire demeanor shifting as the gentle craftsman was replaced by someone far more dangerous. "Old Miguel took a bullet in the shoulder, but he'll live," Bradley replied. "The real problem is what they left behind." He handed Gus a piece of paper. Found this nailed to what's left of the Martinez barn. Gus read the message aloud, his voice grim. Tell the fancy lady her time is running out. She can come to Devil's Canyon alone, or we'll burn out every ranch between here and Santa Fe until someone brings her to us. Isabella's hands trembled as the full implications hit her. Morrison wasn't just threatening her anymore. He was terrorizing innocent families to force her hand. People were going to suffer because of her presence in Canyon Ridge. I have to go to him, she said quietly. I can't let him hurt more innocent people because of me. Like hell you will, Gus said with such fierce intensity that Isabella stepped back in surprise. That's exactly what he wants, to separate you from anyone who can protect you. But people are getting hurt. And more people will get hurt if you walk into his trap, Sheriff Bradley interrupted. Morrison's not planning to let you go free, Miss Fairchild. This is about revenge, not negotiation. Isabella looked between the two men, seeing the grim determination in their faces and realizing that her choice to stay in Canyon Ridge had created a situation that went far beyond personal risk. Morrison's vendetta against her was escalating into something that threatened the entire community. Then what do you suggest? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer. We end this, Gus said simply, his hand moving unconsciously toward his gun. Before he hurts anyone else. The quiet certainty in his voice both frightened and reassured Isabella. She'd known from their first meeting that Gus was a man capable of violence when protecting others. But she'd never seen the full extent of the controlled danger he could project. You're talking about going after them, she said. I'm talking about stopping them, Gus corrected. Morrison made this personal when he threatened you. He made it war when he started burning out innocent families. Isabella realized that the peaceful weeks of ranch restoration had been building toward this moment, when the violence that had brought them together would demand its final resolution. The partnership they'd built, the feelings they'd carefully avoided naming, the future they'd begun to envision together, all of it depended on confronting the man whose silver locket had gleamed in the desert sun with such ominous promise. As the sun climbed higher over the canyon walls, Isabella understood that their time of peaceful building was about to end. The real test of everything they'd discovered about themselves and each other was just beginning. The wanted poster lay spread across Sheriff Bradley's desk like an accusation, its crude woodcut illustration bearing an uncomfortable resemblance to the man who'd threatened Isabella's life weeks ago. But it was the name printed in bold letters beneath the drawing that made Isabella's world tilt on its axis. Benjamin Fairchild, wanted for murder, robbery, desertion. That's impossible, Isabella whispered, her hands trembling as she traced the familiar surname. Benjamin Fairchild died at Gettysburg. My family received notification from the War Department. Sheriff Bradley's expression was grim as he consulted a telegram that had arrived on the morning train. According to this wire from the Army Records Office, Private Benjamin Fairchild was reported missing from his unit 3 days before the battle. They assumed he was dead when he never returned, but apparently he deserted and headed west instead. Gus stood behind Isabella's chair, his presence both comforting and tense as the implications of this revelation sank in. You're saying Blackjack Morrison is actually her cousin? That's exactly what I'm saying, Bradley confirmed. Benjamin Fairchild, son of Isabella's Uncle Thomas, thought killed in the war, but actually leading a gang of cutthroats through New Mexico territory. Isabella felt sick as memories rushed back, childhood visits to Uncle Thomas's estate in Virginia. A serious boy with dark hair and cold blue eyes who'd always seemed to resent the Fairchild family's success. Benjamin had been 5 years older than Isabella, old enough to understand that his father's gambling debts and poor business decisions had left their branch of the family dependent on charity from their wealthier relatives. He was always angry, Isabella said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Even as children, he seemed to blame our side of the family for his father's failures. He said we looked down on them, thought we were better because we had more money. Sounds like the war gave him an opportunity to disappear and start over, Bradley observed. Question is, what does he want with you now? The answer came to Isabella with horrible clarity. My inheritance. The ranch was supposed to go to Uncle Thomas originally, but he died before great-uncle William. If Benjamin can prove he's the rightful heir, or eliminate me as competition, he could claim the property legally. Gus's large hand settled on her shoulder, steady and reassuring. That's assuming he survives long enough to make any legal claims. Isabella looked up at him, seeing the controlled fury in his brown eyes. The revelation that Morrison was her cousin hadn't diminished Gus's protective instincts. If anything, it seemed to have intensified them. The idea that her own family member would terrorize innocent people and threaten her life clearly offended his sense of honor. There's more, Bradley continued, pulling out another document. According to this report from the Territorial Marshal's office, the Fairchild gang has been working their way systematically through properties with disputed ownership claims. They've used intimidation and violence to force out rightful owners, then had Confederates file competing claims in territorial court. So this isn't personal revenge, Isabella realized. It's business. Benjamin thinks he can steal my inheritance and legitimize the theft through legal manipulation. Smart plan, if you're ruthless enough to murder your own family, Bradley said grimly. The question is, what do we do about it? Before anyone could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. A lone rider was approaching at a gallop, and even from a distance, Isabella could see the exhaustion in both horse and rider that suggested urgent news. The messenger turned out to be young Pete Henderson, son of the rancher who'd raised Gus after his parents died. Pete's face was flushed with exertion and fear as he stumbled into the sheriff's office. "Sheriff Bradley, you got to come quick," Pete gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "Morrison's gang hit our place this morning. They didn't burn anything or steal cattle like before. They just came looking for information." "What kind of information?" Gus demanded, his voice sharp with concern. "About Miss Isabella," Pete replied, glancing nervously at her. "The leader, Morrison himself. He was asking all kinds of questions about her routine, where she spends her time, whether she ever travels alone between the ranch and town." Isabella felt ice form in her stomach. "He's planning something more than intimidation." "That's not the worst part," Pete continued. "Before they left, Morrison told my pa to give you a message, Miss Isabella. He said to tell you that family reunions shouldn't be postponed indefinitely, and that he'll be in touch soon to arrange a proper meeting." The words hit Isabella like physical blows. Benjamin knew she'd discovered his identity, and he was making it clear that he intended to confront her directly rather than continue with indirect threats. "He also left this," Pete added, pulling a silver locket from his pocket. "Said you'd recognize it and understand what it meant." Isabella's hands shook as she accepted the locket. The moment she opened it, her worst fears were confirmed. Inside was a photograph of her Uncle Thomas as a young man, standing beside a woman Isabella didn't recognize. But it was the inscription that made her blood run cold. "To my beloved son Benjamin, may you always remember your true family. Mother, 1862. He's been carrying his mother's locket all these years," Isabella whispered, "even after becoming an outlaw, even after abandoning everything decent about his upbringing." Gus studied the locket over her shoulder, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe that's what this is really about. Not just money or property, but proving something to himself about family loyalty and who deserves what." "Doesn't matter what it's about," Sheriff Bradley said firmly. "What matters is stopping him before he escalates further. The Territorial Marshal is sending additional men, but they won't arrive for at least a week." "We don't have a week," Isabella said quietly. "Benjamin isn't going to wait for reinforcements to arrive. He's going to force a confrontation soon, and more innocent people will suffer if I don't face him." "Absolutely not," Gus said immediately. "I won't let you walk into whatever trap he's planning." Isabella turned to face him, seeing the protective determination in his eyes, and feeling her heart break a little. "Gus, he's my cousin, my family's responsibility. I can't keep letting other people pay the price for decisions he made." "Family isn't about blood," Gus said fiercely. "It's about the people who choose to stand by you, who care about your well-being more than their own interests. This Benjamin chose to become a killer and a thief. That makes him your enemy, not your family." The passionate conviction in his voice made Isabella's chest tighten. In the weeks they'd worked together, she'd come to understand that Gus's concept of loyalty and family was based on actions rather than accidents of birth. His willingness to risk everything to protect her represented the kind of devotion she'd never experienced from her blood relatives. "You're right about family," Isabella said softly, her eyes never leaving his face. "But I'm still not going to hide while innocent people suffer because of my presence here." Before Gus could argue further, Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat. "If we're going to discuss strategy, we should do it properly. Pete, ride back to your father and tell him to spread the word. Every ranch family between here and Devil's Canyon should be ready for trouble. Morrison's getting desperate, and desperate men make dangerous choices." As Pete left to deliver his warnings, Isabella found herself alone with Gus and the sheriff, the weight of Benjamin's threats heavy in the small office. The silver locket lay open on the desk between them, its innocent family photograph transformed into something sinister by the violence its owner had chosen to embrace. "There might be another way to handle this," Isabella said slowly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. "Benjamin wants to meet with me, wants to have some kind of family confrontation. What if we gave him what he wants, but on our terms instead of his?" Gus's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that maybe it's time to grant someone a wish he doesn't expect," Isabella replied, her voice gaining strength as her plan crystallized. "Benjamin thinks he holds all the advantages because he has the gang and the willingness to use violence. But he's also carrying around his mother's locket and talking about family reunions. That suggests he still has emotional vulnerabilities we might be able to exploit." Sheriff Bradley leaned forward with interest. "You want to arrange a meeting?" "I want to arrange the right meeting," Isabella corrected. "One where Benjamin discovers that his cousin isn't the helpless Eastern lady he remembers, and where his gang finds out that Canyon Ridge has its own protectors." Gus was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling between his protective instincts and his recognition that Isabella's plan might be their best option. Finally, he nodded slowly. "If we're going to do this," he said, "we do it smart. No unnecessary risks, no heroic gestures that get people killed." Isabella touched the wooden horse he'd carved for her, still tucked in her jacket pocket like a talisman. "Agreed. But Gus, I need you to understand, Benjamin made this personal when he threatened people I care about. This isn't just about stopping a criminal anymore. It's about proving that some choices have consequences, even for family." The determination in her voice seemed to convince him that arguing further would be pointless. As they began planning their response to Benjamin's challenge, Isabella realized that the frightened heiress who'd arrived in Canyon Ridge was gone forever. In her place stood a woman ready to fight for the life she'd built and the people she'd come to love. The silver locket caught the afternoon light, its innocent family portrait, a reminder that sometimes the greatest betrayals came from those who shared your blood, but not your values. The crude map drawn in the dirt behind the sheriff's office showed Devil's Canyon in stark detail, a narrow gorge carved deep into the red rock country, with only one way in and one way out. Gus knelt beside the improvised diagram, using a stick to trace the canyon's treacherous contours, while Sheriff Bradley and Isabella studied his tactical assessment. "Morrison chose his hideout well," Gus admitted grudgingly. "The canyon mouth is narrow enough for 2 men to defend against 20. The walls are too steep to climb, and there's fresh water from the spring at the back end. If we go in the front way, we'll be walking into a killing ground." Isabella studied the map intently, her business mind automatically analyzing the strategic challenge. But hideouts that are easy to defend are also easy to trap people inside. If we could get behind them somehow—" "There is no behind them," Sheriff Bradley interrupted. "Devil's Canyon is a dead end. The back wall is solid rock, maybe 200 feet high." "What about the old mining trails?" Gus asked thoughtfully. "Didn't the Henderson boys use to prospect up in those hills before the silver played out?" Bradley's eyebrows rose with sudden interest. "You think there might be a way down from above?" "Maybe," Gus said carefully. "Pete's grandfather carved some pretty ambitious paths through that country back in the 60s. If even one of them connects to the canyon rim, we might have options Morrison doesn't know about." Isabella felt a flutter of hope, followed immediately by cold fear as she realized what such a plan would entail. "You're talking about climbing down into the canyon while they're holding me hostage." "I'm talking about making sure you're never actually held hostage," Gus corrected firmly. "The meeting happens on our terms, with our backup in place, or it doesn't happen at all." The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of preparation and planning. Isabella had sent word to Benjamin through carefully chosen intermediaries that she was willing to meet and discuss family business, but only at a location and time of her choosing. To her surprise, Benjamin had agreed with suspicious eagerness, suggesting that he was just as anxious for a confrontation as she was. The meeting was set for noon the following day at the old church ruins, 5 miles east of Canyon Ridge. Neutral ground that offered both parties reasonable security while keeping innocent bystanders out of harm's way. What Benjamin didn't know was that Gus and a carefully selected group of volunteers would be positioned throughout the area, ready to respond if negotiations turned violent. "We go over this one more time," Gus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life and death planning. Isabella rides to the church alone, carrying only her pistol and the legal documents we discussed. She keeps Benjamin talking while we get into position. Isabella nodded, though her stomach churned with nervous energy. The legal documents were her insurance policy, proof that the ranch inheritance was legally hers, regardless of any claims Benjamin might make. She'd spent hours with the town's lawyer ensuring that her ownership was absolutely uncontestable, even if something happened to her. "If Benjamin agrees to resolve this peacefully, everyone walks away," Gus continued. "If he threatens you or makes demands we can't accept, you give the signal and we move in." The signal was simple. Isabella would remove her hat and set it on the ground beside her. It was a natural gesture that wouldn't alarm Benjamin, but would tell Gus that she needed immediate assistance. "What if he doesn't come alone?" Isabella asked, though they'd discussed this possibility multiple times. "He won't," Sheriff Bradley said with conviction. "Morrison's too smart to isolate himself from his gang, especially when meeting someone he considers an enemy. But he's also too arrogant to bring overwhelming force to intimidate one woman. My guess is he'll bring 2 or 3 men, enough to feel secure, but not enough to seem weak to his followers." Isabella hoped the sheriff's assessment was accurate. Everything about their plan depended on Benjamin's psychological need to prove his superiority through personal confrontation rather than simple violence. If they'd misjudged his motivations, she could find herself facing the entire gang with minimal backup. "There's something else we need to discuss," Gus said quietly, his tone suggesting uncomfortable truths. "If this goes bad, if Morrison decides to take you hostage or worse, your safety becomes the only priority. Whatever happens to the rest of us doesn't matter as long as you get away clean." "Absolutely not," Isabella said immediately. "I won't be responsible for anyone getting hurt because of my family's problems." "You won't be responsible," Gus replied firmly. "Benjamin will be responsible. This is his choice, his violence, his consequences. But if we're going to stop him, we need to be smart about how we do it." Isabella looked around the small group that had volunteered to help. Sheriff Bradley, Pete Henderson, Tom Murphy from the general store, and Dr. Matthews, who would serve as backup medical support. These men were risking their lives for someone they'd known for only a few months, and their willingness to stand with her against her own cousin spoke to the kind of community she'd found in Canyon Ridge. "I want everyone to understand," she said carefully, "that Benjamin isn't just a random outlaw. He's family, and despite everything he's done, that still means something to me. If there's any way to resolve this without bloodshed, I want to try." "We all want that," Gus assured her, "but we also want you alive and free. If those two goals come into conflict, we choose your safety every time." The absolute certainty in his voice made Isabella's chest tighten with emotion. Over the past weeks, as they'd worked together to restore the ranch, she'd come to understand that Gus's feelings for her went far beyond simple attraction or protective instinct. He cared about her with a depth and intensity that both thrilled and terrified her. "Gus," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice the feelings that had been building between them. "I know," he said softly, his brown eyes warm with understanding. "When this is over, we'll have time to talk about everything we've been too scared to say out loud." The promise in his words gave Isabella strength for what lay ahead. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would face it knowing that she'd found something in Canyon Ridge worth fighting for. Not just the ranch or the community, but the possibility of a future with a man whose courage and kindness had transformed her. Understanding of love itself. As the planning session broke up and the volunteers dispersed to make their final preparations, Isabella found herself alone with Gus in the gathering twilight. They walked together toward the hotel in comfortable silence, both lost in thoughts about the dangerous day ahead. "Are you afraid?" Isabella asked finally. "Terrified," Gus admitted without hesitation. "Not of Benjamin or his gang, but of something happening to you. I've never had anything to lose before, never cared about someone enough that the thought of losing them made me want to hide somewhere safe and forget about honor or duty." Isabella stopped walking and turned to face him, struck by the vulnerability in his confession. "But you're not going to hide." "No," Gus agreed, "because hiding wouldn't keep you safe, and because some things are worth the risk." "You're worth the risk!" Isabella felt tears prick her eyes at the simple sincerity of his words. "I never expected to find this," she whispered. "Any of this, the ranch, the community, you. 6 months ago, my biggest worry was which charity committee to join for the social season." "And now?" Gus asked gently. "Now I'm planning to confront an outlaw cousin who wants to kill me for my inheritance, and I've never felt more alive or more certain about what matters." Isabella reached out to touch his arm, needing the physical connection to ground her swirling emotions. "Gus, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that meeting you changed everything for me. You helped me discover who I really am underneath. All those layers of social expectation." Gus covered her hand with his own, his touch warm and steadying. "You didn't discover anything that wasn't already there. You just finally had a chance to let it show." They stood together in the fading light, both aware that this might be their last quiet moment before facing Benjamin's challenge. Isabella found herself memorizing details. The way the evening breeze stirred Gus's dark hair, the solid comfort of his presence, the gentle strength in his weathered hands. "I should get some rest," she said finally, though she was reluctant to break the intimacy of the moment. "Isabella," Gus said as she started toward the hotel entrance. When she turned back, his expression was serious and intent. "Tomorrow, no. Matter what Benjamin says or threatens, remember that you're not alone. You've got people who care about you, people who'll fight for you. That's not something he can take away or destroy." Isabella nodded, her throat too tight for words. As she climbed the stairs to her room, she could feel Gus watching until she was safely inside. Her preparations that evening were methodical and calm. She cleaned and loaded the pistol he'd taught her to use, checked the legal documents one final time, and wrote a letter to be sent to her Boston family in case she didn't survive the confrontation. The letter was surprisingly brief, a few paragraphs explaining her decision to stay in Canyon Ridge and her gratitude for the life she'd discovered there. What she didn't write about was the love she'd found with a gentle giant whose courage and kindness had taught her that strength came in many forms, that was too precious and too private to share with people who'd never understood her need for something beyond comfortable conformity. As she prepared for bed, Isabella's thoughts turned to Benjamin and the boy he'd once been. She remembered family gatherings where he'd sat apart from the other children, his young face already marked by the bitterness that would eventually consume him. Had there been a moment when he might have chosen differently, a point where understanding and compassion could have changed his path? Tomorrow she would find out if any trace of that boy remained, or if Benjamin Fairchild had been completely replaced by the criminal who called himself Blackjack Morrison. The night passed slowly, filled with restless dreams and periods of wakeful planning. When dawn finally broke over the canyon walls, Isabella rose with a clear sense of purpose. Today would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone in Canyon Ridge who'd chosen to stand with her against a threat they didn't fully understand. She dressed carefully in practical riding clothes, pinned her hair back securely, and tucked Gus's carved wooden horse into her jacket pocket. The small token felt like a talisman of all the goodness and hope she'd discovered in this rough frontier town. Downstairs, Martha Hendricks waited with a simple breakfast and worried eyes. "You don't have to do this, dear," the older woman said, gently. "That man is your blood, but he's no family to anyone decent." "I know," Isabella replied, touched by the concern, "but sometimes family obligations go beyond blood. I have a responsibility to the people here, to the life I've built. I can't run away from that." Martha nodded with understanding. "Your young man is already at the church, making sure everything's ready. That boy would move mountains to keep you safe." Isabella's heart warmed at the description. "He's not my young man, not yet." "Oh, child," Martha laughed softly. "Anyone with eyes can see that man is completely devoted to you. After today, maybe you'll both be brave enough to admit what's been obvious to everyone else for weeks." As Isabella mounted her horse for the ride to the old church ruins, she carried Martha's words with her like a promise. If she survived the confrontation with Benjamin, if they managed to end his threats without tragedy, then perhaps it would finally be time to speak the feelings that had been growing between her and Gus since that first shooting lesson. The morning air was crisp and clear as she rode toward what might be the most important conversation of her life. Behind her, Canyon Ridge was waking to another peaceful day, unaware that their newest resident was about to face the demons of her past in order to secure their collective future. The church ruins appeared ahead, stone walls partially collapsed, wooden roof long since claimed by weather and time. It was a fitting location for a meeting between family members whose relationship had been equally damaged by time and poor choices. Isabella checked her watch. 11:30. In 30 minutes, she would learn whether Benjamin Fairchild could still be reached, or whether Blackjack Morrison had consumed him completely. She dismounted near the crumbling altar, her hand automatically checking the pistol at her side. Whatever happened next, she was as ready as preparation and determination could make her. The wait began. Benjamin's father's pistol gleamed in the desert sun as he approached the church ruins, the ornate silver inlay catching the light with each step. Isabella recognized the weapon immediately, a presentation piece given to Uncle Thomas upon his commission in the Virginia militia, now corrupted by the violence his son had chosen to embrace. Benjamin looked older than Isabella had expected, his face weathered by years of frontier living and marked by the distinctive scar that had made him recognizable as Blackjack Morrison. But underneath the outlaw's rough exterior, she could still see traces of the bitter boy who'd resented his family's relative poverty at childhood gatherings. "Hello, cousin," Benjamin said with mock courtesy as he stopped 20 feet away. "You've grown into quite the frontier lady since I saw you last." "Hello, Benjamin," Isabella replied, keeping her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her stomach. "I was sorry to hear about your father's death. He was a good man despite his troubles." Good men don't die poor and forgotten, Benjamin snarled, his civilized facade cracking immediately. Good men don't watch their families beg for scraps from wealthy relatives who never cared about anything but their own comfort. Isabella could see the pain underneath his anger, the wounded pride that had festered for decades. Uncle Thomas's financial difficulties weren't anyone's fault. Father tried to help whenever he could. Help? Benjamin laughed bitterly. You? Call those occasional loans help. Those condescending visits where your father would lecture mine about responsibility and proper management. Your family took everything that should have been ours and then acted like we should be grateful for. Charity. Two of Benjamin's men flanked him at a respectful distance, their hands resting casually on their weapons. Isabella noticed that both wore the hard expressions of men accustomed to violence, but neither seemed particularly alert to potential threats. Their confidence suggested they viewed this meeting as a formality before claiming their prize. I understand you're angry, Isabella said carefully, but terrorizing innocent families won't change the past or restore what your father lost. You're right, Benjamin agreed with cold satisfaction, but claiming what's rightfully mine will go a long way toward settling old debts. The ranch was left to me legally, Isabella countered, pulling the deed from her jacket pocket. I have all the proper documentation. Uncle Thomas died before great-uncle William, which means nothing, Benjamin interrupted, drawing his father's pistol with practiced ease. Legal documents can be destroyed, witnesses can disappear, and territorial courts can be surprisingly flexible when presented with the right evidence. Isabella felt ice form in her stomach as she realized that Benjamin had never intended to negotiate. This meeting was simply his way of eliminating the last obstacle to his inheritance claim. You're talking about murdering your own cousin, she said, hoping to reach whatever humanity might remain in him. I'm talking about survival, Benjamin replied coldly. Do you have any idea what it's like to watch your father drink himself to death because he could never measure up to his successful brother? To know that everything you should have inherited went to pampered relatives who never worked a day for what they had. So you became an outlaw, Isabella observed. You chose to steal and kill rather than build something honest for yourself. I chose to take what was always mine by right, Benjamin corrected. The war gave me the perfect opportunity to disappear and start over. Blackjack Morrison was born from Benjamin Fairchild's grave, and he's been very successful at claiming what others thought they owned. Isabella could see the madness in his eyes now, the complete disconnection from moral reality that years of violence had created. There would be no reasoning with him, no appeal to family loyalty or common decency. Benjamin Fairchild was truly dead, replaced by a killer who saw her merely as an obstacle to be removed. You've thought this through very carefully, she said, playing for time while scanning the surrounding area for signs of Gus and the others. But you're making one crucial mistake. And what's that? Benjamin asked with amused curiosity. You assume I'm the same helpless girl you remember from family? Gatherings, Isabella replied, her hand moving slowly toward her pistol. You assume I came here alone and unprepared. Benjamin's expression sharpened with sudden alertness. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that Canyon Ridge protects its own, Isabella said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I'm talking about people who value loyalty and courage more than money or blood connections. You're bluffing, Benjamin snarled, but Isabella could see uncertainty creeping into his eyes. Am I? Isabella asked, and made her choice. With a fluid motion that would have made Gus proud, she removed her hat and set it on the ground beside her. The prearranged signal that negotiations had failed, and she needed immediate assistance. Benjamin saw the gesture and immediately understood its significance. You little... His curse was cut off by the sharp crack of a rifle shot from the rocks above the church ruins. One of his men spun around and dropped, clutching his shoulder as his weapon fell from nerveless fingers. I told you, Isabella said, with grim satisfaction, as the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from multiple directions. Canyon Ridge protects its own. The trap was sprung, and Benjamin Fairchild was about to learn that some debts could only be paid in blood. The canyon echo stone amplified every sound in the narrow space between the church ruins, turning Gus's commanding shout into something that seemed to come from the very rocks themselves. "Drop your weapons and step away from the lady." Benjamin's remaining gunman spun toward the voice, his pistol clearing leather with practiced speed. But Sheriff Bradley's rifle spoke first from his concealment behind the collapsed church wall. The bandit's weapon flew from his hand as blood bloomed across his forearm, and he stumbled backward with a cry of pain and surprise. "Impossible!" Benjamin snarled, his own gun now trained on Isabella, even as his eyes swept the ruins for threats. "My scouts said you came alone." "Your scouts saw what we wanted them to see," Isabella replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The plan was working, but she was still close enough to Benjamin's pistol that one wrong move could prove fatal. Gus emerged from behind a pile of fallen stones, his rifle held ready and his expression deadly serious. "Let her go, Morrison. Your fight's with me now." "My fight is with the Fairchild family and their stolen inheritance," Benjamin shot back. But Isabella could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "This doesn't concern you, Cowboy. Everything that concerns her concerns me," Gus said simply, taking another step closer, "and threatening innocent people to get her attention made it personal." Benjamin's laugh was harsh and desperate. "Personal? You think you know what personal means? I've spent 15 years planning this moment, 15 years building the reputation and resources to take back what was stolen from my father." "Your father lost his money gambling and poor investments," Isabella said firmly. "No one stole anything from him." "Lies," Benjamin screamed, his composure finally cracking completely. "Your family conspired to keep us poor, to make sure we could never compete with your success. Well, I'm about to even those odds permanently." He swung his pistol toward Gus, but Isabella had been waiting for exactly this moment. The shooting. Lessons had taught her more than marksmanship. They'd taught her timing and courage. As Benjamin's attention shifted, she dove sideways behind the church's broken altar, her own weapon clearing its holster with surprising speed. Benjamin's shot went wide, chipping stone from the wall where Isabella had been standing. Before he could fire again, Gus was moving with the fluid grace that always surprised people who judged him by size alone. His rifle cracked once, and Benjamin's ornate pistol spun away across the dusty ground. "It's over," Gus called out, his weapon now trained on Benjamin's chest. "Surrender, and you'll live to see trial." But Benjamin wasn't finished. With a cry of rage and desperation, he pulled a hidden knife from his boot and lunged toward Isabella's position behind the altar. His years of outlaw living had taught him that desperate situations sometimes required desperate gambles. Isabella saw him coming and tried to bring her pistol to bear, but the angle was wrong and Benjamin was moving too fast. She rolled sideways, trying to create distance, but her skirt caught on the broken stonework and slowed her escape. Benjamin's knife descended toward her heart and struck the solid wood of Gus's rifle stock as he interposed himself between them. The impact drove both men to the ground in a tangle of limbs and weapons. Benjamin's smaller frame, no match for Gus's size and strength, but still dangerous because of his desperation. They rolled across the dusty ground, each trying to gain advantage. Benjamin still held his knife, slashing wildly at Gus's arms and shoulders, while Gus tried to pin the smaller man without seriously injuring him. Blood flowed from several cuts on Gus's forearms, but his grip never loosened. "Should have minded. Your own business, Cowboy," Benjamin gasped, trying to work his knife free for another strike. "Should have chosen a different profession," Gus replied grimly, finally managing to slam Benjamin's knife hand against a rock hard enough to numb his fingers and send the weapon skittering away. With his advantage gone, Benjamin made one final, desperate play. He pulled Isabella's silver locket from his shirt, the same locket he displayed during their first encounter, and held it high. You want to know the truth about your precious family? He called out to Isabella, his voice ragged with exertion and defeat. This locket belonged to my mother, but the woman in the photograph isn't her. It's your great-aunt Sarah, the woman your great-uncle William was supposed to marry before your grandfather stole her away. Isabella stared at the locket, understanding beginning to dawn. What are you saying? I'm saying the whole Fairchild. Fortune was built on betrayal. Benjamin laughed bitterly. Your grandfather seduced his brother's fiancée and married her for her dowry. Everything your family has came from money that should have stayed with William's branch of the family tree. The revelation hit Isabella like a physical blow, but before she could fully process its implications, Sheriff Bradley and his deputies had moved in to restrain Benjamin. The fight was over, but the outlaw's final words had opened questions about her family's history that would take time to resolve. As Benjamin was hauled away in chains, still ranting about justice and family honor, Isabella found herself sitting on the broken church steps with Gus beside her, both of them breathing heavily from the confrontation's intensity. Is it true? She asked quietly. What he said about my great-aunt Sarah, does it matter? Gus replied gently. Whatever happened 3 generations ago doesn't change who you are now or what you've built with your own hands. Isabella looked at the locket Benjamin had dropped, its silver surface catching the sun like an accusation. Perhaps there was truth in his claims. Perhaps her family's wealth had darker origins than she'd known. But Gus was right. The past couldn't be changed, only acknowledged and learned from. The echo stone caught her whispered words and carried them across the canyon. No more debts, no more guilt. Time to build something new. The battle was won, but the real victory would come in the choices she made with her freedom. The simple gold wedding band caught the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows of the restored ranch house, its plain surface reflecting none of the ornate complexity that had marked the jewelry of Isabella's former life. She turned the ring slowly in her fingers, marveling at how something so simple could represent such profound change and promise. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at the church ruins. 6 months of healing, building and learning to trust in the future she and Gus were creating together. The ranch bore little resemblance to the rundown property she'd inherited. Fresh paint gleamed on the house and outbuildings, new fencing marked clean property lines, and healthy cattle grazed in pastures that had been restored to their former productivity. But more than the physical transformation, Isabella cherished the emotional changes that had occurred. The frightened heiress who'd fled Boston society had been replaced by a confident woman who could manage livestock, balance accounts, and make decisions that affected dozens of lives. The ranch employed 12 people now, most of them families, who'd found prosperity and security in the operation she and Gus had built from determination and shared dreams. Mrs. McCall, came a voice from the kitchen doorway, and Isabella smiled at the title she was still learning to answer to. Martha Hendricks stood there holding a steaming cup of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose romantic predictions had been thoroughly vindicated. You don't have to keep bringing me coffee, Martha, Isabella protested gently. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. Nonsense, Martha replied with mock severity. You're 8 months along with that baby, and your husband would have my hide if I let you do more than you should. Besides, someone needs to make sure you're resting properly. Isabella accepted the coffee gratefully, her free hand moving automatically to the gentle swell of her abdomen where their child grew safely. The pregnancy had been a surprise, a joyful one that had sent Gus into a protective frenzy that made his earlier concern for her safety seem casual by comparison. Through the window, she could see her husband working with young Pete Henderson to repair a section of fence damaged by the previous night's storm. Even at a distance, Gus's imposing figure commanded attention, but Isabella's eyes were drawn to the gentle patience he showed as he taught Pete the proper technique for setting fence posts. That combination of strength and kindness had first attracted her, and 6 months of marriage had only deepened her appreciation for both qualities. "He's going to be a wonderful father," Martha observed, following Isabella's gaze. "He already is," Isabella replied softly. "He talks to the baby every night, tells stories about the ranch and the horses, and all the adventures they'll have together. Sometimes I think he's more excited about becoming a parent than I am. Men like Gus have a lot of love stored up," Martha said wisely. "They're just waiting for the right family to share it with." Isabella nodded, thinking about the wooden toys Gus had been carving in the evenings, a complete barnyard of animals, each one crafted with the same attention to detail he'd shown in the horse he'd given her that first week in Canyon Ridge. The horse still sat on their bedroom windowsill, a reminder of how far they'd both traveled from the people they'd been when fate brought them together. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the front yard, where Sheriff Bradley was dismounting with his characteristic, careful movements. Since Benjamin's trial and conviction, Bradley had become a regular visitor to the ranch, partly for official business, but mostly because he'd developed a grandfatherly interest in Isabella's welfare. "Afternoon, ladies," Bradley called out, removing his hat as he climbed the porch steps. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just enjoying the quiet," Isabella replied, gesturing for him to join them on the shaded porch. "Gus is working on the south fence if you need to speak with him." "Actually, it's you I came to see," Bradley said, settling into one of the comfortable chairs they'd added to make the porch more welcoming. "Got a letter from the territorial prison about your cousin." Isabella felt her stomach tighten slightly. Benjamin had been sentenced to 20 years for murder, robbery, and terrorizing civilians, but she'd deliberately avoided thinking about his fate. The revelation about their family's history had been thoroughly investigated and largely confirmed. Her great-grandfather had indeed stolen his brother's fiancée and her substantial dowry, setting in motion the generational resentment that had eventually consumed Benjamin. "What about him?" she asked carefully. "He's been asking to see you," Bradley said gently. "Says he has things to say that might bring some peace to the situation." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, her hand instinctively moving to protect her unborn child from the echoes of old pain. "What do you think, Sheriff? Is it worth opening those wounds again?" "That's not for me to say," Bradley replied, "but I will tell you that prison seems to have changed him some. The warden says he's been reading, helping teach other inmates to write letters home. Maybe facing real consequences for his choices has helped him remember who he used to be." Before Isabella could respond, Gus's voice came from behind them. "If Isabella wants to see him, I'll go with her. If she doesn't, that's the end of it." Isabella turned to see her husband's tall frame filling the doorway, his expression protective but not possessive. One of the things she loved most about Gus was his complete trust in her judgment, even when his instincts urged him to shield her from potential harm. "I think I do want to see him," Isabella said slowly, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. "Not for his sake, but for mine. I need to close that chapter completely before our baby arrives." Gus nodded, understanding, though she could see the concern in his brown eyes. "When?" "Next week," Bradley suggested. "I could arrange an escort. Make sure everything's handled properly." "Thank you," Isabella said. "I think it's time to finish what we started at the church ruins." As the afternoon wore on and Bradley took his leave, Isabella found herself standing in the nursery she and Gus had prepared. A cheerful room filled with handmade furniture and toys, painted in soft yellows and greens that would welcome either a son or daughter. The wooden horse from Gus sat on the windowsill here too, waiting to be passed on to the next generation. "Are you sure about seeing Benjamin?" Gus asked quietly from behind her. "I'm sure," Isabella replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "I want our child to grow up free from the shadows of old family grievances. If there's a chance for genuine forgiveness and healing, I need to explore it." Gus's arms came around her, careful of her pregnancy, but strong enough to make her feel completely safe. "Whatever you decide, We'll face it together." Isabella covered his hands with hers, marveling at how the simple gold band on her finger had come to represent everything she'd never known she wanted. The emerald brooch that had once symbolized her privileged past now rested in a jewelry box upstairs, replaced by this plain circle of gold that spoke of partnership, commitment, and love freely chosen rather than socially expected. Together, she agreed, watching the sunset paint their restored ranch in shades of gold and promise. The baby kicked gently against her ribs, as if agreeing with their parents' plans for the future. Whatever tomorrow brought, meetings with forgiven enemies, challenges of parenthood, or simply the daily joys of building a life worth living, they would face it with the strength that came from love tested by fire and proven true. Outside their window, the cattle grazed peacefully in pastures reclaimed from neglect, while the wooden horse caught the last rays of sunlight like a beacon of hope for all the adventures yet to come.